We have George Newbery with us here tonight, and I'm going to send everybody to your website, George. Head over to preREO.com for more information about what he and his team work on there. But this is going to be an interesting conversation. I appreciate your time here tonight.
Thanks a lot, Jack, for having me on.
I took a look at your book that you have out. It's that Burn Zones, and I'll put the link to that as well in the show notes. But just based on the chapters alone, it looks like you've had quite a lengthy career jumping from one thing to the next. How did you end up where you ended up here?
Yeah, sure. It's funny through my life. I've always set a goal. I work towards it. Lots of times I get to where I want to go and then it gets boring and I move on to something else. And it's sometimes I wish I just hit the goal and just was content with that. But that's how my mind works. I've tried as I've gotten older to get better at that. And I've done the same thing for the last 14 years. So that's the longest time I've stuck to something. So I'll tell you, here's the journey. When I was young, I started delivering papers when I was 7. I bought an ice cream truck where I would sell ice creams at football games and in the neighborhood. When I was 13, at 15, I started a record company in my parents' garage. This is early 80s, Southern California. I put out 8 albums of LA hardcore punk bands. And that was fun. And then I decided they had the Olympics in 84 in LA. And I said, they had the bike race. I said, I'm going to become a bike racer. I get this idea that I just work really hard towards it. And lo and behold, 1988 comes around. I was in the Olympic trials and I finished 40 seconds. The year after that, I got good at bike racing. Actually, I was traveling around the country on a trade team, but you really don't make much money as a bike racer. And I was now 24. I had to find a real job. And I happened to get a job through a friend in a mortgage company, answering the phone and setting appointments for loan officers. And that was my job. And I went into that job knowing nothing about real estate, knowing nothing about mortgages. And 6 months later, by using the same focus and determination that I'd applied during my bike racing career, I now was applying that to mortgages. And 6 months later, I was top producer. 2 years later, I had my own mortgage company, which is still around. And then I started buying real estate. And I'd always look for the biggest challenges. So I'd buy the most challenged buildings I could find. I started out with 4 units, then 19 units and 60 units. And the biggest property I bought in Los Angeles was 298 units in downtown Los Angeles. And this building it had sold. So I bought it in 1988, but it had sold in 1992 for $4 million. The property was in such bad condition that the owner was put in jail for slum housing. They have a slum housing task force in California, and they put him in jail. So he sold it to another buyer for $2.5 million, and he got put in jail. And so he sold it for $2 million, and that guy got put in jail as well. So now no one wanted to buy the building because you're thinking easy logic. Hey, buy this building, go to jail. And so they were selling it for $850,000. Now picture this, 298 units, downtown Los Angeles, 850,000, just ridiculously attractive numbers. And they were marketing this property and no one wanted to buy it. And here comes me looking for a big challenge. I said, no, I'll buy it. And I knew some of these inspectors from the other projects that I'd done, granted much, much smaller. And they said, don't buy this thing. We're going to end up adversarial. You've done well on these other projects, but this one is going to be a problem. And I didn't listen and I went ahead and bought it. Now, these were inspectors. We had plumbing, fire, health, electrical. There was a group of inspectors in this task force, and they would come around every month and they'd tell me, hey, you're doing good work. And at the outset of this thing, right after I bought it, they scheduled a meeting and they said, hey, you got 6 months to get this thing done. And if you don't get it done in 6 months, we can't selectively prosecute. We're going to have to prosecute you. And I said, no problem, I'll do it. And so they'd come by every month and they say, hey, good job, you're making good progress. And I was making really good progress. But 6 months later, a friend of mine called me, and this is a couple of days before the new year. And he said, hey, you're in the paper. And I said, what for? And he said, oh, the headline is Redondo Beach man charged with 30 some criminal violations. And these were criminal housing violations. So now I was the one at risk of being put in jail. I was obviously quite concerned. That was a very tough weekend. It was on a Friday that the newspaper came out. And the first
Always the case, isn't it? On
yeah,
that
exactly.
Friday, you got to toil over it all weekend.
I got my mind is stressed. And I'll tell you the first thing, I lived about 10 minutes from my parents' house. And the first thing I thought about was my mom sitting down for her morning cup of tea. She's British and reading reading about me in the paper about all these criminal charges against her son. So I drove over as fast as I could to my parents' house. I grabbed the paper. It was the Los Angeles Times. They had not opened it yet. I pulled out that section and I said, bye. And and I didn't tell them until this was all over. I didn't really tell them the full story of their son being at risk of going to jail. And the whole weekend stressed out. On Monday, I got a hold of my attorney. He called the city attorney. The city attorney said, "Hey, we can't selectively prosecute, but we have heard from the task force that your client is making good progress." They allowed me to stay out of jail, continue to make progress. I paid a $10,000 fine and I was put on probation, but it was the lightest form of probation, summary probation, which it basically means that as long as you don't get in trouble again, you don't go to jail. So 11 months later, I had this property signed off by all the inspectors and they had to come. There were a couple of false starts because they came out and they'd find something. So there had to be one day where they could walk through every floor of the property and not find a single violation. And that in fact happened a few days before Thanksgiving that had to be 1999. And then I sold the property, made a significant amount of money. And that was it was good and bad. I made some good money, so that was nice. I felt that I had succeeded where everyone before me had failed. And so that was emboldening. But what it did was it made me very confident and maybe overconfident. I said, hey, I'm going to do this around the country. I'm going to buy the worst properties I could find, the biggest and the worst. And I'm going to turn them around and I could make good money doing that. And that's what I proceeded to do.
So, there's a lot to unpack there, but you just at the end there, you said you believe that you might have gotten a little too big for your britches and tried to tackle some other projects. What do you mean by that? I know according to some of the stuff I've read, it sounds like you did lose quite a bit eventually and you had to bounce back. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. I had a string of success and then one extraordinary failure. So I'll tell you how this played out. My first big acquisition after the Ford Hotel in Los Angeles was a property called Pickwick Plaza in Kansas City, Missouri, 233 units. I bought it at a courthouse steps auction for $1.6 million. And I proceeded to fix it up. And about a year and a half, 2 years later, I refinanced with Wells Fargo. And again, I bought it for 1.6. I put in maybe $1.5 million. So I was into about 3. They appraised it for 8.5 million and they gave me a $5 million loan. So I got all my money back plus, and I still owned the property, which was now operating and cash flowing. So I was like, wow, I like this game. Let me do it again. So I kept buying. I bought in Oklahoma City. I bought in Indianapolis. And then I found myself at a bankruptcy court, or I went to a bankruptcy court auction for Woodland Meadows Apartments in Columbus, Ohio, which was one of the largest apartment complexes in the entire country, 1,100 units, one in one location, 52 acres, 122 buildings. It was like a mini city. There were thousands of people. By the time I got it all occupied, there were thousands of people that were living there. Just this massive property with streets running through it. And what was really attractive about it. It was a really nice property, but it backed into the highest income area in Columbus, an area called Bexley. And here we had a low income housing project, which had been through extraordinary mismanagement and now had gotten so bad that it was nicknamed Uzi Alley, Uzi after the gun, because it was a haven for drugs, gangs, prostitutes, just out of control. And but I could buy it cheap. It wasn't that cheap, but I bought it for 13.5 million for 1,100 units. It's pretty cheap. And so I bought it. Which was big news. The local papers, here's this guy from California buying this property in Uzi Alley. Does he really know what he got into? Blah, blah, blah. And the next headline was, hey, this guy just moved in, because I moved into the property. And most people thought that was really noble. Hey, this time it really may be different because this guy, if he doesn't have hot water, neither do the tenants. And there were plenty of days at the beginning where there was no hot water. But the reality is, I'd done it at some of the prior properties. It was really A, cheap, and B, it was tough to say, hey, I'm going to spend money staying at the Hilton, and then I'm going to go during the day to my low-income housing complex. So I wanted to be on the site, and A, it saved money, but B, I heard firsthand what was going on. If things were, I felt it like a tenant, and I responded accordingly. These were battles to turn them around. I relished the battle. And it wasn't so I was battling people, I was battling years in many cases of mismanagement and challenges at the property and trying to turn this thing around. And I think it helped that I was there. And some of the tenants appreciated that. Didn't mean that they wouldn't knock on my door and say, "Hey, something's wrong with my unit," but it was helpful. And we turned that property around. It was an extraordinary success story. And I'll tell you some of the things we did. When we moved in, when I took over, there was a security force at the property. They had a dozen uniformed, armed bodyguards, all white, eh, the way I saw it was they were almost debating the problem. In some cases, a small situation would sometimes turn into a large situation, and sometimes the security wasn't helping that. And I'll tell you, probably one of the most unbelievable things is one day I went down to the security office, and there was a guy in the security office behind bars. There was actually a jail in the property in the security office. So what the security would do is they would make citizens arrests and put the usually tenants or friends of tenants for whatever infraction. They would put him in the jail at the property, and then they would call the real police who would show up and then arrest the people. It was a challenge situation, and I asked him to please let that one guy go. He was in our jail for marijuana possession, and I said, "We're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to have the jail. There's really something serious. The police can come out and deal with it, but we're not going to have our people making these arrests." And that was shortly thereafter, we actually disbanded the security force. We completely let them all go, laid them all off, and we replaced them with tenants who became part of a community patrol, unarmed, and were people, just as a majority of any housing complex across the country, the majority of the tenants there typically just want to have a nice, safe place to live. And a lot of the tenants wanted to be part of that. And we started turning around the property. The crime rate dropped by more than half. We were able to, and we created a training program so that many of the tenants were part of the crews that did the work to the property. And it really helped turn it around. When we started that training program, people would show up, and the first time, like 5 people showed up. But after they actually got real jobs, lots of people were showing up, and we had speakers from the outside. We had contractors teaching tenants, "Hey, here are some skills." And it really worked. It was something that got a lot of media attention. And then other companies from outside the complex started hiring our tenants. And it was really, when somebody would see tagging a wall that they had just painted, wait, I don't want to have to paint that over. Do this at another place. So it really turned their property around, a huge success story. And now I was further emboldened, but there was an unhappy ending to Woodland Meadows. The property on Christmas Eve, 2004 was hit by an ice storm, which was the largest federally declared disaster in Ohio history, and just devastated our property. And it triggered this extraordinary sequence of events in which I ended up losing everything. And not only losing everything, I ended up $26 million in debt. I look back at 14 years worth of extraordinarily hard work, and I gave it all back and then some. And that was a challenge period in my life. And that's my journey.
What happened there? Did you just not have the proper insurance, or it was?
Yeah, no, I had the insurance. I had $50 million of insurance. What I did not realize, because I'd never been in this predicament before, is that if you have a really, really big claim like we did, the insurance companies will just not pay, and they will make you sue them in order to get them to pay. And they know, or they appear to know, that the longer they go without paying, the more, at least in my case, the more distress you'll get. And eventually you'll settle for something less than you really are entitled to, but you feel that, hey, you don't have a choice. And so the insurance company came out a few days after the storm, and they let me know that we were not covered. They said that this damage was caused by the boilers, and the boilers, we didn't have boiler endorsements on our insurance. And as a result, we're not covered. Now, that was ludicrous. We had the boilers inspected 2 or 3 months before the storm. The state came out and inspected them, and they were fine. And the reason all the damage occurred is that the property was, the temperature outside was -8. The power had been knocked out to half the city of Columbus, including all of our property. And so once the power goes out, all the boilers stop working again because of the power outage. And so when the boilers stop working, the heat or the water that gets heated in the boilers and gets pumped through each of the units and radiates heat that all stopped working. And so that water that was in the radiant in the pipes all froze. And then the domestic water all froze. So picture this, thousands of people living there, no electric, no heat, and no water, and temperatures outside in the below zero. Just an extraordinary situation. So what happened is several days later, once the temperature started warming up, the pipes all started bursting, and all these 122 buildings, the first floor units were partially subterranean. So the window was at your chin would be at the window. And that was so all those first floor units got flooded with water. All the other units were significantly damaged. There were trees in the buildings. It was a disaster area. In fact, the Red Cross opened a shelter for our tenants across the street at a church, and it was truly a disaster. And that is now I went to my attorney, and my attorney said, "Hey, this is what the insurance companies do. We have to file a lawsuit. Eventually, they're going to pay." And so with that, I thought, oh, okay, so this will work out. I just have to play their game. And so we filed the lawsuit. I made probably the biggest mistake that I could have. I made several myself at the time, but the big mistake I made was I said, okay, I'm going to borrow money on my other properties, which were doing fine. And I'm going to take that money. I'm going to use that to fund the renovations. And that was a big mistake. What I should have done is done nothing. Hey, if the insurance isn't going to pay, I can't fix this up. And let that property kind of win or lose on its own. Instead, I involved all my other properties, borrowed on them, and I started using that money to repair Woodland Meadows. Now, in my original thinking was, hey, this is going to take $5 million. So we spent the $5 million, and there was still tons of work to do. We kept finding more damage. So then I borrowed more money, and by summer, and again, this happened at Christmas, by the following summer, I was out of money, and I had about 200 people a day working at the property. I dropped it down to 20. And the city started asking, "Hey, what's the pace is slowing? We got to get this property back back fully habitable." And at some point, the mayor summoned me to City Hall and said, "Hey, we need you to bring your tax returns or financials for the property, blah blah blah." So I brought them all, and they said, "Hey, do you want to that we have some other plans for Woodland Meadows? Do you want to take your Section 8 contract, your low income housing tax credits? Do you want to take those and move them to another property that you could buy? And we'd support that." And I was single-minded. I know my vision is going to rebuild this property. So I said, "Thank you very much, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to rebuild Woodland Meadows." Now, that single-minded focus and determination of reaching a goal, which had generally served me well through my life, now was not serving me well, because what I did not read between the lines is that the city, if I did not agree to their offer, they were going to still do everything they could to take the property. And in fact, that's what's happened. They eventually took control of the property. They started by coming out to the property and issuing notices, 3-day notices to evacuate the property. They said that all 122 buildings were subject to imminent collapse. And this is a result of us taking off drywall allegedly exposed a construction defect that was done by a prior owner. And as a result, these buildings were subject to imminent collapse. Now, I didn't believe it. And so I hired an engineer. The engineer came out and said, these buildings are fine. And we went to court and got a temporary restraining order against the city. And we showed up in court. We had our engineer to testify. We had his report, and the city was there. And the judge was like to the city, "What's your basis?" And they had no engineer's report. They had no engineer. They just said, "Looks like they're subject to imminent collapse." So the judge gave me the temporary restraining orders, and they also entered a deal that said, okay, if we make us on rebuilding the rest of the property, then the city would back off and would not proceed with this evacuation. So I told my attorney, make the best deal you can with the insurance company, get whatever you can, and then we're going to settle, and I'm going to finish building this thing out. Now, the insurance company, we eventually settled for $32 million. Now, obviously that's a massive amount of money, but the damages were over $45 million. So it was really a good deal for the insurance company to get out for that amount. We took the $32 million. We were back to 200 people a day at the property. We had the court appointed a monitor to attend our construction meetings every week and do inspections. And that monitor was reporting back to the court that we were ahead of schedule, that we were making great progress. Now, unfortunately, the city, despite being a party to this settlement agreement, they went ahead and had a meeting with HUD and told HUD to pull our contract. So HUD came out They were at the property about 5 minutes and they said, "Hey, there's work that needs to be done here. You have 30 days to fix it." Now, I had just entered into this agreement with the court that I could get this done in 6 months. I could not get it done in 30 days. So I went back to court and said, "What?" I said, "This is inconsistent. We made this deal with the court that we're going to get this project done in 6 months. All the reports are coming back saying we're ahead of schedule. And the city and HUD is telling us we have 30 days to get this thing done." The judge ordered HUD to appear in court. And HUD sent word back and said, "We're not coming. We're a federal agency. We're not bound by a municipal court." So they didn't show up. And at 30 days after they came out, they came back out. They were out there for about 5 minutes. They said, "You're not done with the work." They then sent me a letter saying your HUD contracts are all terminated. And that was the end. I'd spent a bunch of that money. And now eventually the city took ownership of the property, demolished all the other buildings, got rid of low income housing in that section of Columbus. And now they own the property. Years later, they still own the property. And I left town just absolutely broke with all my other properties in foreclosure or in other distress. And I'd signed personal guarantees on just about everything. So that made up the large chunk of my $26 million.
Yeah, wow, that's a heck of a story. So you went from distressed properties now to distressed mortgages.
Yeah, what happened, it was humbling. I felt feelings of failure, shame, guilt, embarrassment. Where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? I always play it back. If only I'd done this differently, then everything would have turned out better. But I made the decisions. I bought the property in the first place. I made the decisions. I took the risk. I made these deals because they were risky. And this is the one bet that did not pay off. And I always figured, hey, if I work really hard, I can make anything pay off. And it didn't work this time. So that all by the end of 2005, I was broke, and 2005, 2006. But then in 2007, I started hearing about, hey, there's millions of families at risk of foreclosure. And my thought was, hey, this is something I could use my experience as an overwhelmed debtor. I could use it to help these other families who are suffering who are also overwhelmed with debt. And many a times those same feelings, shame, guilt, embarrassment, I could feel what they were going through, because when this happened to me, I was getting sued. I was getting served with lawsuits, collection notices, collection calls. Everything bad that could happen was happening, and to just an extreme degree. And I never filed bankruptcy, so the stuff just kept coming at me. And so I felt my experience would be helpful to all these families that were at risk of foreclosure. So why not start a nonprofit, which was American Homeowner Preservation. We started in 2008. The mission was to help families at risk of foreclosure stay in their homes. And that's how we started. It was myself. We had an office in Cincinnati, Ohio, myself and two other people. And it's now grown a great deal. We originally were trying to advocate on behalf of each family with their servicer or mortgage holder. We had thousands of families that came to us. We were only able to help about 10%. So we changed our approach and we became a for-profit, and we started buying defaulted mortgages from banks and hedge funds, primarily in low and moderate income neighborhoods across the country. And that worked, because once we could buy these mortgages and we could buy them at big discounts, we could then go to the family, share the discounts with them. If they wanted to stay in the home, we could modify. If they didn't want to stay, we'd offer them cash for a deed in lieu. And that was the path that worked. We bought more than 10,000 mortgages in the last decade. And now we've started that company that we started with three people, American Homeowner Preservation, has morphed into 9 different companies, from a national mortgage servicer, a national mortgage originator, a title insurance company, and several other companies, a trustee, as well as pre-REO. So pre-REO is a marketplace where institutions sell their non-performing mortgages to real estate investors. And so it's like auction.com, except instead of selling, auction.com sells REOs, some institutions, to real estate investors. Pre-REO sells non-performing mortgages from institutions to real estate investors. And that is a platform that we're really excited about. We're getting great interest from institutions. And we anticipate at some point there's going to be another downturn. And when that downturn hits, we're trying to build our capacity so that we can be a preferred outlet, the number one outlet for these distressed mortgages, to get them in the hands of real estate investors. Because ultimately, the best buyer for a defaulted mortgage is somebody local who can, if it goes REO, they're okay. In fact, some of them, I'm happy if it goes REO, but if it goes a different direction, a modification or some other solution, they're happy that way too. But that is the profile of the buyers that we're attracting to pre-REO, and we're getting institutions. We have some of the biggest funds in the country, some funds backed by Goldman Sachs and other big investment banks that are selling their defaulted assets on our platform. So it's an exciting time. It's something that we're really trying to build for in anticipation of the next downturn.
We both have been using the term REO and pre-REO. For those new listeners among us, we better tell them what that acronym means.
Yeah, absolutely. So an REO is real estate owned. It is a property that's been foreclosed on, typically by a bank or other mortgage lender, and oftentimes is then sold. They sell it. Usually, it's a profile of a typical REO is something that needs a little bit of work. Sometimes needs a lot of work, and so it's bought by an investor, and then they do the work and they rent it or they resell it. Now, pre-REO is basically something that's a defaulted mortgage loan that is either in foreclosure or eligible for foreclosure and has the potential to become an REO. In our experience, once a loan falls into foreclosure, in the majority of the time, it will end up being foreclosed upon. But there are some that go to deed in lieu, modifications, short sale, different paths, but the majority do become REO. That's the difference.
Sure. And then your platform, can anybody go there and search for these opportunities, or they have to be a part of a
No,
bigger organization?
no, that's the beauty of it. It's anyone can go at pre-REO. They can right away register, free buyer registration, and then they can have access to see all the pre-REOs that are available. And we want it to be open to everybody. Historically, the non-performing note market has been very opaque, has been tough to break into for new investors. We had when we first started buying mortgages, it was really tough to figure out, hey, we want to buy mortgages, but just because you want to buy mortgages doesn't mean you can buy them. They're tough. It's tough to find. So that was something that we have grown. We had to do a lot of networking to find people to actually help sell us our first group of mortgages. Once we started buying, then people started reaching out to us. But that was always
So it's an interesting concept, the pre-REO being able to help these families if they want to stay in their properties. What type of discounts have you typically seen when a company is trying to just get this off their paper?
absolutely. So if the property is worth 200, and let's say the mortgage is 220, let's say, the mortgage will typically be sold on pre-REO for 75% of the property value. So in that case, $200,000 property value, the mortgage will likely sell for $150,000, 25% discount, and then we finance it. So if the investor wants, we'll provide 75% financing. So they put down 37,500, 25% of the 150,000, we'll finance 112,500. And so
Oh,
that's made it really accessible because most real estate investors almost always get loans to buy and you leverage their money. And so that way they can buy multiple properties. So here they can buy multiple pre-REOs.
so you act as a financial institution as well then to help the investor with
Yeah,
the acquisition.
absolutely. So pre-REO makes money in two ways and we make it transparent too. So we charge a 5% program fee, which is like a buyer's premium at the closing. So if someone buys a pre-REO for $100,000, they'll pay $5,000 at the closing. That's how we make our money. And that's just like auction.com or Hubzu, everyone charges 5%. The other thing we do though, is there's really no financing available in the market to buy defaulted mortgages. If you're a really big hedge fund, there's financing, but if you're buying 50 or 100 million, but if you're buying 1 or 5 or 10 defaulted mortgages, there's not financing available. So we created the ability to finance. So we'll provide the financing to our investors, to our pre-REO buyers. And so that's we do that at 12%. And then we crowdfund. So if we crowdfund that money. So if somebody wants to they can't find a pre-REO that they're interested in, they can invest in pre-REO and they earn a 7% return. Basically, we're taking that crowdfunded money where we pay out investors up to 7% and we loan it to investors buying these notes at 12%. And so that's the other part of the revenue model.
So then the person can go to the current resident if we catch it early enough, because you've purchased it at a discount. Now you can reduce their monthly payments, allowing them to stay in it, maybe extend the mortgage to 30 years again, that type of thing. There's probably a variety of creative ways to help them stay in the property at that point.
You're absolutely right. They can extend the maturity, reduce the interest rate, reduce the payment, whatever's appropriate. If there's some delinquent, lots of times in this market where values have gone up. And so many times some of these families have equity or close to having equity, take the delinquency, we'll add it onto the loan amount will then extend the loan term, just like you said. And so you keep the payment affordable, make it less than what they were having trouble paying before. And lots of times the families will run into job loss, divorce, death in the family, unexpected medical expense. One of these things will impact their ability to pay. But lots of times it's something that is short. 4 months later, get another job. 4 months later, something happens, so they're back on track. But those 4 months that they missed, if it was $2,000 a month, all of a sudden they're 8,000 in the hole, and they can't get out of the. I can come up with the 2,000 a month, but I can't come up with the 8,000. So sometimes it's just taking that 8,000 and spreading it out over time so they can catch up. There's all kinds of things to do. And lots of times real estate investors will respond to that and say, wait, I like the idea of doing a modification, but I don't want to hold this loan for 30 years and just collect payments. I want to invest, add value, and resell. Like with an REO, if they get an REO, they're going to do just that. So what we've done is, how I explain it is, if you buy a non-performing mortgage today at a discount, you do a modification, the family starts paying again, 6 or 12 months of on-time payments from that homeowner, you can likely sell that loan as a reperforming loan for a significant premium. And so that is the other component to that strategy. That said, the majority of what is on pre-REO will end up being foreclosed upon. It's just, that's what the statistics tell us. Once it's in foreclosure, it's going to get foreclosed upon. Now, that means that the investor may get the property back. In some cases, especially lately, a lot of them have simply been selling at the courthouse steps, and then they buy it at a discount, then they get whatever the bid that the investor sets, however much they set the bid at. They may just make their profit by having it sold at the courthouse steps. So the investor has control over the dispositions. If a family wants to mod, the investor has to say yes or no, or they could say, like, counter it. It needs to be extended for another 2 years or whatever they want to do. And that is, so the investor gets control over the destination. Ultimately, it's their return and the asset that they now control.
Sure. So it sounds fairly straightforward. I feel like I'm missing something here. What are some of the downfalls? Like, what am I missing?
I'll tell you, we've been doing this for about almost 2 years, pre-REO. AHP's been around for 14 years, the parent company, but pre-REO for 2 years. The market in that time frame has gone up. So people have done really well on the platform. A lot of people have made tens of thousands. Some people have made hundreds of thousands. This is on single assets. One guy made over $1 million on a single pre-REO that he bought. It was a big one. He bought it for 1.8 million, but he did just extraordinarily well. And that is so where's the downside? Now, the downside, where's the risk, is that if the property values start going down, which is potential, it's going to happen. Real estate historically is cyclical. So the real estate values could go down, and that would impact how much money the investors, how well they do. Now, the good news is, because they're buying at a 25% discount, that insulates them largely from market fluctuations. Simply, hey, if it went down 10%, there's still money to be made. It's just going to be less money. As the property values go down, so will the prices of the mortgages. And right now, it's 75% values. The average between 70 and 75% of values where the pre-REOs have been selling. But once there's more supply, the market for the resale cools off a little bit, that percentage and the prices are likely to drop. So that's how the market is. It's going to be something where I encourage investors right now to buy a pre-REO, to experience it, get that experience today. And then knowing that when the downturn hits, there'll be an overabundance of opportunities on pre-REO is what I expect. But you don't want to be learning then. You want to learn it today and then be ready and go once this thing really turns up.
Does your platform serve the entire country then, or is it just,
Yes,
yeah?
absolutely. Nationwide, we've offered. That said, I don't think we've had some of the less lightly populated states. We probably haven't had much activity, but I know we've had pre-REOs in more than 40 states.
Sure. Yeah, because the reason I ask is because I've tried to market to like pre-REOs in my market. For some reason, I can't even seem to pull that list. Maybe that's just because it's not publicly available.
Yeah, in most states, it is public record. It's just sometimes maybe tough to get the records, but I'll tell you that the market's also been thin. COVID, the moratoriums have all ended, the foreclosure moratoriums. But that said, there's still a lot of the servicers and mortgage lenders are trying to find ways to keep the families in their homes and exhaust those options. So I expect the foreclosure rates to really rise. They're rising now, but expect it to really rise in 2023.
Yeah. You bring up the economic turmoil we're experiencing right now. I feel like we're just early into this. What do you see regarding your market? What kind of changes are you going to see?
Yeah, here's how I interpret the market today. We're on the longest expansion in our country's history, and historically, the market expands and contracts, which is healthy. That's the way it should be. It has expanded for an extraordinary period of time. It is due, in fact, it's overdue for a contraction, and we're starting to see some of that. If you look back at 2006, 7, you'll see that the rate of appreciation accelerated and then hit a high point, and then it started dropping. And the property values weren't dropping, just the rate of appreciation started slowing down. And then in 2008, it actually went to the point where, hey, the property values aren't going up at a slower pace. Now they're actually going down. And we haven't hit that point. So there's still data that property values are going up, but just at a slowing pace. And I think at some point over the next, call it 6 to 18 months, there will be that point where, wait, property values are going down. And once people hear that, the market, that kind of feeds it. It's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Everyone, the market's in trouble. I would think people already feel that right now, but I'll tell you, I still see, we have a lot of REOs that we market that we still see multiple offers, people paying strong prices. I have family members who are buying homes right now. They keep coming back disappointed. Hey, I made 3 offers. I got outbid on everyone. And so that's still out there today, but it's got to be near the end of it. And whether there's 6 more months or 9 or 12, we have to be nearing the end.
Yeah, I can just speak for my market. The time on market has started to lengthen now that the interest
Hmm.
rates have been going up. No, this has been a really interesting conversation, George. In fact, I hope you'll consider coming back because
Oh, I'd
I
love
feel
to.
like we've just tip of the iceberg when it comes to your experiences and some other things here, especially regarding notes, because we could spend all kinds of time just on that aspect. But before I let you go, I do have some follow-up questions here. But before I do that, I want to send everybody to your website again, preREO.com. I'll make sure to have that link in the show notes. So if you're on your podcasting app, swipe right there and I'll make it a
Mhm.
clickable link. You could just head over to George's website. But first of all, is there a question or concept you wish we would have covered here today?
No, I think I shared my story. I shared the current opportunity, which is what we see as a great opportunity for real estate investors to transition to note investing, especially there's still limited inventory in a lot of markets. So it's a way to find a steady flow of deals, even when the real estate opportunities are limited.
So I got a few rapid fire questions. You can answer them
Please.
as quickly as you want here.
Okay.
So first of all, we think Rich Dad Poor Dad is almost like Stairway to Heaven. That's not an allowed answer. What's one real estate investing book you would recommend our listeners to read?
Sure. So I got to be selfish, but it's a good book. Let me see if I can put it on the screen. Burn Zones is the book
Sure.
that I wrote about the story that I just shared. It's available on Amazon. It is as my other business started growing, as I grew, I had to explain what I shared on the story today to investors who were looking to invest. And I was explaining over and over because they see the news stories, the bad credit, the judgments. And finally, I wrote a book which kind of shared everything that happened. And so Burn Zones is available. I think it's a lot of it's has a lot of good reviews on Amazon. And what's really I think been rewarding about it is people come up to me and said, "Hey, I had this thing happened to me. I had this failure or something like that," and they appreciate that I shared my story and also that I've rebounded from it.
Sure. What's the last book you read and would you recommend it?
Sure. What is the last book I read? That is obviously I haven't read. Yeah, you know what's a good book? Scaling Up, Vern Harnish. I read that in the last 6 months. It's a good book. I'd actually read it like 5 or 6 years ago, but it was helpful to refresh. As my business grows, some of the stuff that impacts me or I can better relate to it today. Scaling Up, Vern Harnish, great book.
Mindset is such a huge aspect to our business and keeping your mind and mental health correct. What's the one thing you do to keep your mindset and your motivation to keep moving forward?
Sure. I need to exercise. I ran this morning up in the woods near where I live. That's been really helpful. Stressful times, you go out running. It could be running, could be playing tennis, could be working out, whatever you do, riding a Peloton. Whatever it is, it for me, and I think I hear from others too. You go out, you start the activity with a problem, you come back with a solution, and it's something that really is refreshing. And sometimes you got to force yourself to do it. Tear yourself away from work, tear yourself away from the problem. But that 30, 45 minutes, an hour that you spend can be really pays huge dividends, not only keeping you healthful, but it burns off some of that stress.
Okay. What is the what's the best piece of entrepreneur or business advice you've ever received?
As a business owner, 3 good employees equals 1 great employee. And I've learned to pay for the best employees I can find. And I shouldn't say employees, team members who you just get so much more mileage out of somebody who's driven, ambitious, wants to be great. And that is something I do. I appreciate the good employees, but I really want to surround myself with great employees.
And on the flip side, what's the worst business advice you've received?
Worst business advice I've received is wow, that's a good question. Thing is, I'll give you some good advice and then I can try and twist around and make it bad advice. So don't look back. Don't look back. So it's really tough. If you think about the NBA, if you watch basketball or whatever, misses a shot, gets fouled, something goes wrong. They got to get it out of their mind right away and keep playing, go to the next play. If they keep it in their mind, it's going to affect their play. Same thing in business, same thing in life. If something goes bad, you need to move on promptly. Let that other stuff slide off your back. Otherwise, it's like a cloud that hovers over you. So what would be the learn from your mistakes? You actually have to learn from your mistakes. You're actually going to learn more from your mistakes than your failures. But in terms of the bad advice part of that is, I guess if you're constantly, you want to learn from it, but you got to move on. And so I guess
Yeah. I heard an analogy once regarding that. Yeah, I heard somebody say, if you keep looking back at the past, you're going to trip over the present.
that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, you need to move on. The
Yeah.
past, it's good success or failure. A lot of success. Like I've had a lot of success. Sometimes it's been bad for me. Like some of the things makes you at some point it may be overly emboldened and this thought that I can no matter what some of those at me, I can get through it. And that generally worked until the one time it didn't and caused me just personal financial collapse.
Sure. And then one last question. If you could get into DeLorean and head back to when you were first getting into real estate investing, what is one piece of advice you would tell yourself?
Be patient. And I would have probably kept what I bought. I've touched thousands of pieces of real estate, thousands of notes. And oftentimes I bought when the market's weak, I've sold when the market's strong. And sometimes the opposite, unfortunately. But it would have been, I should have probably set aside some and just say, I'm going to keep this. Mix up, buy, sell, make cash. But I kept rolling the cash into new deals. Why not set aside some and anticipate at some point I'm going to have some challenging times. And I'm less optimistic now than I was back then, but I'm still an optimist, but I do see risk more. And I know that risk, danger, failure is lurking around every opportunity. And you have to navigate that. And I think when I was younger, I definitely didn't recognize it. So be a little more cautious, a little more prudent. Don't lie, dive. Now, the reality is some of the successes I had was because I was a really quick start. If I saw an opportunity, I grab it. But I didn't always look, and that still served me well most of the time, but not always. Not always.
George, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for putting up with my rapid fire there at the end.
Oh, no problem. It was a
But
pleasure.
again, head over to preREO.com, and I hope to talk again sometime.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.